You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 343. This is our bonus episode recorded on January 17th for release on January 20th of 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line this week is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
This week, we're going to be talking about a topic that I've been very excited to talk about for a while, and I know that Rachel has been as well. And this is going to be about the invention of double seam canning, which is kind of a funny thing to talk about, I think. But one of the things that we've been trying to do on Arsenal for Democracy over the past couple of years, and especially over the past year, is to talk about those things that really only got maybe, let's say, 2 paragraphs in your U.S. history textbook in high school if you were lucky. So you might remember hearing something in history class about how one of the big features of the Second Industrial Revolution from a consumer standpoint, from a citizen standpoint, was that canned food goods became a major feature of life. The other thing that you might remember is that a couple decades later, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, there was various legislations and reforms undertaken during the Teddy Roosevelt administration to promote food safety. Now, Rachel, you work in the arena of food safety, so I figured you would be the appropriate person to come on and talk about this. We're not going to obviously go into a huge amount of the whole history of food safety, but this is going to be an important pivot point in U.S. food safety history, right?
Yeah, food is super important, obviously, and as the Industrial Revolution expanded, food started being able to be transported from farther and farther away, so everybody's diets changed as a result of canned food.
Yes, so we're going to be specifically talking about double seam canning from 1888 because that's smack in the middle of the Second Industrial Revolution, and that also indicates a lot about what was going on at the time and what the differences were between this period and the First Industrial Revolution. So obviously, canning as an overall process is something that's existed for quite a long time, especially, or at least, putting things in jars to preserve them and stuff like that. That's been around for quite a while. And in the Napoleonic Wars, there was a big push for having some sort of way of transporting food and preserving food for all the soldiers who are constantly marching around Europe. And so the what we would now consider to be the earliest canned goods, as opposed to like people preserving their own stuff in jars, but like canned goods produced in factories and things like that. That emerges in the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of in the early 19th century. It then ramps up during the First Industrial Revolution, which again, as sort of a rough benchmark, when we're talking about the First Industrial Revolution, we're talking about stuff from the late 1700s until the middle of the 19th century, or basically a good cutoff point is in the United States is to talk about pre and post Civil War. So 1860 and earlier versus later, or in Europe, you're probably talking about something like the wars of German unification under Prussia, which were also happening in the 1850s, 1860s, and culminating in 1870. These wars have a lot to do with the timing of that, which is why they're a good benchmark to use, because it has a lot to do with sort of the capital that was floating around for all these investors to build up these significant companies. But that just gives you an indication of the timing that we're talking about. So canning, as I said, had begun to ramp up toward the end of the First Industrial Revolution because of the huge military demand for canned goods. It had emerged initially with the Napoleonic Wars when there was a huge demand, but then there continued to be various other wars. And as I said, these wars in Europe that were happening in the 1850s, involving Italy, involving Germany, and so forth in the 1850s, and then in the 1860s, and this is also obviously the Civil War in the United States in the 1860s, we have this significant demand for canned goods, and this meant that in both Europe and the United States, canning factories significantly expanded production during the war on the government dime. They were given the money to make these expansions, and then what you say, okay, well, what do you do after the war? Well, after the war, you've already got the factories in place. You don't have to spend your own capital because the government's paid for it. Now you can repurpose this for civilian production, and so we start getting the emergence of a consumer canned goods economy as a potentially significant force in the very early Second Industrial Revolution period after these wars of the 1860s. Double seam canning arrives in 1888, and that is a significant innovation in canning that is what really creates that thing that you might have read about in your textbook at some point about the consumer goods economy being related to canned goods, department stores, things like that. This is one of those aspects. So what is double seam canning? This is a specific technique for manufacturing the can, and it requires a number of different things that had come into existence at various points during the 19th century. First of all, it involves rubber, right? This is a new component in the process for canning with double seam canning is this rubber insert, and that requires you to have, and we'll hopefully do an episode on rubber as a whole because we alluded to that on our bicycles episode a couple months back, but you need to have access to rubber production and be importing that and know what to do with it. You also need sheet metal die cutting. This requires a number of processes, shearing processes, die manufacturing, etc. This all grows out of tool and die innovations of Eli Whitney for the U.S. military in the War of 1812. He's the guy who invented the cotton gin, as everyone knows, and as I've said previously, we will try to do an episode on the cotton gin specifically, a new sort of take on that at some point later this year. Another thing is that you need a can seamer machine. This is specifically for putting together this double seam canning. And so essentially what the end result is something like what you would see basically with canned goods today, which is that you have these two layers of metal, you have a rubber sort of insulant and sealant component, and you've basically pancaked these all together and stamped them and pressed them and everything, and you get this nice double seam that is folded over the rim of your can, and that has various helpful preservative effects that we're about to talk about. Now, double seam canning, in the 1860s, a few decades before double seam canning, we have, of course, Louis Pasteur's work, understanding food safety better, understanding how bacteria is spread, things like that. But this is not something that contributed to the invention of double seam canning or the rise of this new wave of canned goods. It just happened to be the case that this invention happened to help with preventing the spread of various foodborne illnesses. And we can see why that is based on the work of Louis Pasteur, but this is not something that they were taking into account at the time. Safer canning was already accomplished without really understanding why, and industrial canning factories didn't actually care that much about food safety either way. This was not a big priority for them, and that is one reason that, of course, poisonous food preservatives were still in use in food until after the turn of the century with those previously alluded to food safety campaigns during the Roosevelt administration. So that brings us to an important question, which I want to pose to Rachel. Was this a technology, double seam canning, that improved safety, or was it a technology developed in search of safety? Because I think there is a distinction there. If it's something that they set out to make it, food safer, that's one thing. If it happened to make food safer, that's a completely different story. And I think that is worth exploring. The social and material consequences of double seam canning are: 1, you're less likely to get diseases in canned foods. 2, there's no more lead soldering on the seals, and that's obviously safer as well. And 3, perhaps most importantly for this time period, it's faster and cheaper to produce than previous canning methods at the time. So Rachel, I guess I'll pause there. What do you think about this question over the double seam canning and its impact on food safety?
Yeah, I think double seam canning as a technology, the food safety improvement is kind of a side effect. I think the big problem with these canning companies was there was a lot of wastage that was happening. If there was improper sterilization, improper heat treating, there was just a lot of spoilage on the shelves. The famous visual that we've all been warned about is like dented cans or swelling cans that very obviously show that something went wrong during the manufacturing process. And obviously, these companies were trying to reduce the wastage, and the improvement in health safety was just kind of an added benefit.
There had also been an improvement in canning before double seam canning, which was vacuum canning sealing in factories. Amanda Jones patented that in 1872, and then in 1890, she opened a canning factory that would only employ women, ostensibly to advance the cause of feminist self-determination and empowerment. That business failed in 1893. So there had been other improvements before double sealed canning that also probably helped with food safety. But again, a lot of this doesn't really seem to have to do with improving food safety per se. It's about improving the profits of the company by reducing the food safety problems. But again, not really understanding why that was. I mean, they didn't understand exactly what the relationship was between making safer cans with better sealants that avoided getting bacteria in them in the first place. They didn't understand how that worked. They just did it, and it had benefits.
Right. I think we have to go into like the 1890s before we start really getting into studying exactly what heat treating does and how it affects the level of bacterial contaminants in food. So one big thing is William Lyman Underwood, who was the son of the founder of the William Underwood Company that canned foods, kind of famously canned hams or deviled hams. You still see those in the store today, the little devil on the can. He was actually a skilled photographer, and he went to MIT and actually photographed the bacteria that was contaminating these canned foods. And it was very important. They could actually photograph the bacteria and actually study how heat treating, both the temperature and the length of time, affected bacterial food contamination. So they figured out the thermal death time, the amount of time needed to kill these bacterial contaminants. And so they really advanced food safety for their company and for the industry, really.
Yeah, so thermal death time, if you could explain that a little bit more, I guess I understand it that it's how long you have to heat something for to kill bacteria and at what level of heat. And that was also something that was not immediately introduced in the canning process, and that came later with this research.
Yeah, so it's a pretty complicated mathematical equation that really talks about how to determine the exponential reduction in food in these contaminants. So they're trying to determine how long it takes to reduce the bacterial population by 90%, or 1 log 10 at a given temperature. So the longer you heat treat it, the greater the reduction in these bacteria counts. So one of the targets in canning is 12D. So you're reducing the number of bacteria by 90% 12 times. So you're reducing the amount of bacteria by a factor of 10 to the 12th degree. So the DR for C. botulinum, which is like the big contaminant, the most deadly contaminant. So the DR for this organism is about 12.6 seconds. So a 12D reduction takes about a little less than 3 minutes, or 151 seconds. And this is actually taught in university courses in food science and microbiology to this day. And it's also applicable to cosmetic and pharmaceutical manufacturing, two other industries where reducing contamination is vital to the safety of the product.
But again, even in the case of Underwood's research at MIT, this was relatively late in the process. The company had been around for quite a long time, and he was doing this research starting in 1896, publishing these papers, and was not really about food safety itself, right? This was not about making people get less sick itself. It was about making sure that you didn't have as many cans have to get thrown away by your vendors, made sure that you didn't have customers complaining or requesting their money back because of problems with the canning. This was about saving money for the company and generating higher profits more than anything else. So not exactly a huge victory for capitalist market forces solving all of the world's social problems.
Right. Yeah, it definitely was about reducing wastage and maximizing profits for the company. I think that's kind of like at the time. So Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, he was trying to point out the worker dangers in these factories, but instead people just latched on to like, oh my goodness, it's the food safety, which definitely wasn't the primary problem that Sinclair was trying to point out. So yeah, it's all about the bottom line for the company basically, and the consumers were obviously worried about their safety, but that definitely wasn't really the primary consideration that the company was putting into this research.
So again, over the process of the first and second industrial revolutions, it takes a while to launch and then significantly improve a consumer canned goods economy. But this is one of the defining sort of like trademark noticeable features of the second industrial revolution from the perspective of ordinary people. As you said, you can now transport food over long distances more easily. We're going to be talking more about food transportation issues in the 19th century on a future episode, and food preservation issues, which of course also ties into canning. People's diets were changing, the cost of food was going down, and so forth. And there's no specific point because there were all these various iterative innovations. But if you had to pick one, double seam canning in 1888 is sort of the big one because it made it a lot cheaper to produce these cans. It required certain changes to have already happened in the economy in order to facilitate that. And it happened to make the food safer, although that was not the objective of it, because double seam canning is safer in its preparation and keeping bacteria out than earlier designs of cans had been. One other thing that I wanted to point out that I just found sort of bizarre and fascinating is that although, again, as we said, canned goods from at least a military perspective were invented for, factory production and so forth, were invented in the Napoleonic Wars, which lasted from the end of the 1700s into 1815. It was not until 1855 that can openers were invented. That was totally bizarre to me, and it's something that I had no idea. So before that, like, soldiers were mostly the people who were eating canned goods as opposed to consumers, and they would have to just bash it open with a rock or puncture it with a bayonet. Again, that's multiple decades where they just did not have a can opener for canned goods. I would have thought that would have been like the first thing you invented to go with your canned goods.
Right, I agree. I was unaware of that fact as well. Like you'd think some inventor at the time would have patented a purposeful can opener before 1855.
And I think that's also got to be an obvious thing of what is the difference between the first and second industrial revolution from a consumer standpoint? Well, it's the existence of widespread consumer canned goods. And what is the reason for that? Well, there wasn't a can opener in the first one. I mean, like, just a truly bizarre sort of twist of history there. Again, required a whole bunch of things to happen in a sequence in order for this emergence of canned foods for consumers to happen. And again, I think it is really critically important to emphasize the other reason that we're picking this as sort of a important vignette that illustrates a lot about the sort of rise of the modern economy is that relationship between military and imperial projects and so forth and the consumer side of the economy, much in the same way that there's, space race had various effects on the consumer economy a century later. We're looking at a period here where the wars of the 1850s and the 1860s are necessary precursors in order to have a consumer canned goods economy, because there wouldn't have been all of these factories online able to produce these goods cheaply for consumers if they had not ramped up production significantly and built all these factories to do that in order to supply the government, which was paying for those factory improvements and expansions in the first place.
Yeah. Another interesting aspect is like after it became more of a civilian good, you actually had to convince civilians that canned goods were okay to eat. It definitely didn't look like any food product that would be familiar to them. So there was a lot of mistrust at first. And so I think this increase in food safety really did a lot to increase that consumer trust, just because it was so alien to what food looked like prior to it coming out on the market. And I think that's another reason why they were so dedicated to determining this thermal death time, and improving the safety, was just to increase consumer confidence, because it was so new and so unfamiliar that you really had to kind of stoke the trust in canned foods. And something else I wanted to mention was there was a botulism outbreak from canned olives that were canned in California in 1919 and 1920, and it actually led to the canning industry in California cooperating with public health officials to create these regulatory standards for heat treating their products, and greater oversight by the California State Board of Health. They did actually agree to being audited and inspected by the California State Board of Health. And I think it wasn't out of looking for food safety. It was just kind of protecting that confidence from consumers in their canned goods. And also, olives were kind of a prestige food. It was something that rich people put out on like platters at their dinner parties. So you definitely wanted to create that consumer confidence among the elites, which would then trickle down to the lower classes, the working class. They would see rich people eating these canned olives and having that prestige food, and then it would increase their consumer confidence and cause them to go out and buy more canned goods because it was this prestigious item to buy.
Well, Rachel, I'm glad that you emphasized this aspect of it, because that's the final thing that I wanted to talk about before we wrap up today. Shorter bonus episode this week since we had a long one last week. So, as you alluded to earlier with the Underwood company and their canned goods, they had been around for a while. They had actually supplied canned goods initially to Western pioneers and Union soldiers. Now, you talk about lack of consumer confidence, and a lot of that does have to do with legitimate food safety concerns. It also, as you said, has to do with unfamiliarity with the foods. I don't think it inspired a huge amount of confidence as well that if you had exposure to canned goods and familiarity with canned goods, it was probably from having served in the Union Army during the Civil War, and you probably didn't have a particularly high recommendation to make of that to the folks back home. You probably said, if you were lucky enough to get that as opposed to something like hardtack, you'd probably say the food was gross, it was weird, and it made me sick because it wasn't particularly safe. So, as you said, one way of improving consumer confidence and interest in this food is to demonstrate that it's safe. Okay, but the other thing, and this is again why double seam canning and canned goods in general are such a perfect thing to talk about with the Second Industrial Revolution as a whole, which is why it gets a paragraph in the textbook in U.S. history classes, even if they don't explain this fully, is what is the other way that you improve consumer interest and confidence in your goods during this period? This is something that canned goods are also inextricably linked to as a force within the U.S. economy, and something that, of course, continues to today, and that is advertising, right? Canned goods advertisements are some of the sort of most recognizable early ads. Obviously, there were ads, long before this. You can go back to, the newspapers in the 1700s and find ads, right? But in terms of the ads, that we would recognize as being conventionally modern marketing, right? That looks like the stuff that's, you can draw a line between that and the Mad Men era, and draw a line between that and today's advertising and marketing. This is the stuff that we talked about on our recent bonus episode with Patrick from Conspiracy You Can Believe In about planned obsolescence and marketing and consumer advertising and things like that, getting people to buy stuff that they wouldn't ordinarily buy, right? That's the other thing. If you've built all these factories for the war effort to supply canned food goods to the soldiers, and then you have all these factories after the war, it's not just that you have the capacity to supply consumer canned goods, it's that you need to in order for your company to continue to exist and not go bankrupt, right? You need to generate new sales. So how do you generate new sales? It's through advertising. So you have colorful pictures of illustrations of cans, right? As opposed to just weird lines of text like you would have in an old-timey newspaper from the, before the first Industrial Revolution. This would have these glossy ads in newspapers and magazines about what great canned goods you can get and how this can be part of your home, etc., etc. This is one of the things that contributes to the birth of modern advertising as we would understand it and recognize it, is this rise of canned consumer goods. This is a cheap consumer good that you need to sell a lot of and convince people that it's a good idea, that they want it, that's something that they've never previously bought, and to get eschew the previous fresher local foods that they would have been buying. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the fact that you've now got this urban base that is cut off from a lot of the local agriculture that they previously would have been around before the increased urbanization. And we talked about urbanization and, the changes in the agricultural sector in the second industrial revolution on an episode that we did in 2020 with you and me and I believe Kelly. But I thought that this was sort of an interesting specific example that highlights so many of the trends of this period and also demonstrates why the second industrial revolution is such a good insight into our current economy, even if it might seem like there's a lot of differences.
Yeah, you can definitely tie a lot of our current economic conditions to this rise in direct-to-consumer advertising and marketing things to consumers. That really had its roots in that second industrial revolution.
Rachel, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule as a microbiologist working in food safety to talk about an earlier period in American food safety history, canned goods for consumers, specifically the era of double-seamed canning.
Yeah, this is a really fun topic to talk about.
Thanks for listening.